Rock and roll exploded across 1950s America with such raw energy and defiant spirit that it inspired teenagers to claim their independence and helped blur long-established racial boundaries, launching the first true musical revolution of youth culture. Did you know that in the 1950s, the FBI considered rock and roll music so dangerous they kept secret files on its biggest stars? Let's uncover how 5 legendary musicians didn't just create great songs, they sparked a revolution that changed America forever. Still think rock and roll was just music? Think again, because these musicians were true revolutionaries who changed the world, one guitar riff at a time. What started as a controversial sound became the heartbeat of a generation. Rock broke down racial barriers, gave voice to the voiceless, and showed that music could be a powerful influence for social change. It didn't just challenge social norms, it created a new language of youth identity. For the first time, teenagers weren't just waiting to become adults. They were a cultural force, with their own music, fashion, and social expectations. Born from a powerful mix of rhythm and blues, jazz, gospel, boogie-woogie, electric blues, and country, this new sound emerged from the margins, breaking down racial barriers when the rest of America was still segregated. Artists like Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley weren't just musicians, they were cultural revolutionaries. 1950s America was a decade stuck in ice. On the surface, a picture of perfect conformity, pristine suburban homes, men in gray flannel suits, women in crisp aprons, children instructed to be seen and not heard. But beneath this polished veneer, a pressure cooker of social tension was building. This was an America of brutal contradictions. The same nation that had just defeated fascism was actively maintaining its own system of racial apartheid. Segregation wasn't just a law, it was a way of life. Drinking fountains, schools, restaurants, even entire cities were legally divided by race. The Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 had theoretically ended segregation in schools, but reality was very different. 1950s America was also a nation trapped in the Cold War's paranoid grip and desperately clinging to post-World War II conformity, where the average family lived under a suffocating blanket of social expectations. McCarthyism had America in a stranglehold of fear. Communism was the boogeyman, and conformity was sold as patriotism. Any deviation from the prescribed social norm was viewed with suspicion. Musicians who challenged this status quo weren't just artists, they were cultural insurgents. The FBI actually kept a file on rock and roll, considering it a potential threat to American society. That's right, music was so powerful that the federal government saw these musicians as dangerous revolutionaries. The 1950s were a powder keg of cultural tension. Conservative America thought that rock and roll was a threat, a wild, dangerous sound that would corrupt the minds of innocent teenagers. Mothers clutched their pearls, radio stations hesitated, but nothing could stop the musical tsunami that was about to hit. It wasn't how it challenged every social norm, it's that it became the unexpected weapon of social change, a musical revolution that would crack these foundations wide open. Here's a truly mind-blowing fact. Rock and roll was so threatening to the establishment that the Soviet Union banned it, calling it capitalist propaganda. Imagine music being so powerful that a world superpower saw it as a national security threat. As an aside, did you know that the term rock and roll was actually music industry slang for sex long before it became a musical genre? DJ Alan Freed popularized the term, borrowing it from rhythm and blues lyrics. But what truly made this music compelling wasn't just its sound, it was its power to unite. Do you remember teenage girls screaming at Elvis's hip-shaking performances, parents in shock, and a whole generation finding its voice? Rock and roll gave young people something powerful, a soundtrack of rebellion, independence, and pure unbridled energy. In those days, television performances were electric. When Elvis first appeared on national TV, he didn't just perform, he transformed the cultural landscape. His music, his moves, his attitude challenged everything America thought it knew about youth and entertainment. Speaking of television, Did you know that in 1950, only 9% of American households owned a television, but that by 1960, the number exploded to 87%? Rock and roll rode this technological wave, turning musicians into national icons who could broadcast their message directly into living rooms across America. In this explosive decade, 5 legendary artists emerged as the true architects of rock and roll, each bringing their unique sound, style, and rebellion to a world desperate for change. The unexpected genius of Chuck Berry, the true poet of rock and roll, crafted lyrics that told stories of teenage life, rebellion, and dreams. In an era when interracial interactions could result in violence, his music created a sonic democracy. When he performed, race lines blurred. His lyrics spoke of teenage dreams and social mobility, radical concepts in a deeply class-conscious society. Johnny Be Good, his major hit, tells the story of a poor boy who could become a star through talent and determination. It wasn't just a song, it was a blueprint for social transformation. A musician from St. Louis, Berry single-handedly defined the rock guitar sound. Fun fact, Johnny Be Good was so groundbreaking that NASA chose it as the rock and roll representative on the Voyager Golden Record, the first rock and roll song sent into space. Imagine, Chuck Berry's music is literally traveling through space, potentially the first rock song to be heard by extraterrestrial life. Here's something else about him you might find interesting. He was a trained barber before becoming a rock and roll legend. But his legal troubles are even more shocking. Berry spent 2 years in prison in the mid-1940s for armed robbery, a past he transformed through his music. Then there was Little Richard, a force of pure, unbridled energy. With his vivacious style and earth-shattering voice, Richard Penniman broke every social rule. His hit, Tutti Frutti, in 1955 was more than a song. It was a declaration of freedom. Openly challenging racial and sexual norms, Little Richard proved that music could be a weapon of radical self-expression. His performances were subversive. In a decade of rigid gender norms, he challenged everything. His flamboyant style, his unapologetic femininity, his raw sexuality, these were political statements. When mainstream culture demanded conformity, he screamed, "Tutti Frutti." He was fighting for individual freedom before the civil rights movement had its own language. Little Richard's life was a series of shocking reinventions. Did you know that he was an ordained minister who would periodically leave music for religious life? He'd go from performing in wild sequined suits to preaching in churches, then return to rock and roll. Talk about a life of extremes. Here's a noteworthy fact. Little Richard claims he invented the famous rock and roll piano technique. He said other musicians would watch him and literally take notes on his innovative style. Elvis Presley. The king who shook more than just his hips was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. Elvis was a poor Southern boy who became the ultimate cultural disruptor. He didn't just sing, he merged white country music with black rhythm and blues, creating a sound that terrified parents and electrified teenagers. When he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, over 60 million Americans watched, and the world was never the same again. Elvis Presley offered a mix of racial musical genres that panicked conservative America. He openly celebrated and popularized black musical traditions, bringing rhythm and blues to white audiences. Southern segregationists saw this as a threat, music that could literally break down racial barriers. When Elvis shook his hips on television, he wasn't just performing, he was challenging every social restriction of the era. Most people don't know that Elvis was a twin. His brother Jesse was stillborn, a fact that haunted him his entire life. But here's an even crazier tidbit. Before becoming a music icon, he worked as a truck driver and was so shy that he was terrified of performing. His first recording at Sun Studios was actually a gift for his mother. He paid $4 to record a song for her birthday. And get this, Elvis was a natural superhero for civil rights way before it was cool. When radio stations refused to play black music, he openly credited black musicians as his primary inspiration. He once said, "The colored folks been singing it and playing it just like I'm doing for more years than I know." In a segregated America, that was a revolutionary statement. The innovator nobody expected, Buddy Holly, the nerdy genius who changed everything, was legally blind without his trademark glasses. But despite his thick glasses and unassuming look, Holly was a progressive force in rock music. He was one of the first musicians to use multi-track recording, essentially inventing modern music production techniques. He's often regarded as the artist who defined the traditional rock and roll lineup of 2 guitars, a bass, and drums. Buddy Holly represented another trailblazing concept, the musician as an autonomous artist. Before him, performers were typically told what to sing and how to perform. Holly wrote his own music, controlled his sound, and showed a generation of musicians that they could be more than just performers. They could be creators. His tragic death in a 1959 plane crash known as The Day the Music Died became a defining moment in rock history. The Beatles have repeatedly credited Holly as their primary inspiration, with Paul McCartney purchasing his publishing rights to preserve Holly's legacy. Buddy Holly was also a major influence on future popular musical artists like Bob Dylan, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, the Hollies, Elvis Costello, and Elton John. He was among the first artists inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986. And let's not forget Fats Domino, the New Orleans piano man who proved that rock and roll had soul. With hits like Blueberry Hill and Ain't That a Shame, Domino brought the infectious rhythms of New Orleans to the national stage. He was so influential that when the Beatles first came to America, they covered his songs, a testament to his massive impact. His music was a celebration of Black cultural resilience, transforming the pain of segregation into joyful, revolutionary sound. Fats Domino, the unsung hero, sold more records in the 1950s than any other artist. Yes, even more than Elvis. Born Antoine Caliste Domino Jr. in New Orleans to a French Creole family, Domino signed to Imperial Records in 1949. His first single, The Fat Man, is cited by some historians as the first rock and roll single and the first to sell more than 1 million copies. It's sad to realize that he's often overlooked in rock and roll history. During Hurricane Katrina, people feared he had died, but Domino was rescued from his New Orleans home, proving he was as resilient as his music. Elvis Presley said Domino was a huge influence on me when I started out, and when they first met in 1959, described him as the real king of rock and roll. Rock and roll wasn't just about music, it was about revolution. It gave teenagers their first true cultural voice. Before the 1950s, teenager wasn't even a recognized social category. Suddenly, young people had an identity, a style, a way of expressing themselves that terrified and fascinated the older generation. The music challenged everything: racial boundaries, sexual norms, generational expectations. When Little Richard sang, when Elvis shook his hips, when Chuck Berry played his guitar, they were doing more than performing. They were reshaping American identity. The music industry itself was a microcosm of broader social struggles. Record labels were predominantly white-owned, but the most innovative music was coming from Black artists. Figures like Alan Freed, a white DJ who championed Black musicians, were rare bridges in a segregated landscape. These artists weren't just musicians, they were cultural revolutionaries who used 3-minute songs to challenge segregation, break social barriers, and give voice to a generation hungry for change. They transformed music from entertainment into a powerful tool of social revision. These weren't just artists and musicians. They were mathematical equations of rebellion. In a decade of conformity, they wrote the code that would eventually crack the system wide open. The FBI feared them, parents condemned them, but they transformed America more powerfully than any politicians of their time could. They reprogrammed an entire generation's understanding of freedom, identity, and possibility. By the end of the decade, the groundwork had been laid for the massive social movements of the 1960s. Civil rights, women's liberation, anti-war protests all found their early roots in the rebellious spirit of rock and roll. Who's your rock and roll hero? Drop the name of your favorite artist in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. and stay tuned for our next exploration of the golden era of the 50s and 60s.